If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe and hit the bell, share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is James Hawthorne, but everyone here just calls me Jim. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Forest for 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me. But what happened in October 1963 changed everything I believed about our world. I still remember that morning perfectly. The fog was thick, wrapping around the tall pines like ghostly fingers. It was unusually cold for October, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. As I sat in my cabin sipping my morning coffee, I couldn't shake off this strange feeling in my gut. Something felt different. Being alone doesn't bother me anymore. Not since Sarah, my wife, passed away 2 years ago from cancer. The forest became my only companion after that. The familiar sounds of birds, the rustling leaves, and even the occasional bear, they all became my new family. My time in the Korean War taught me how to survive, but it was Sarah who taught me how to live. Now with my graying hair and the scar on my left cheek, a gift from an angry mountain lion, I probably look exactly like what I am, a weathered old ranger who's seen too much. That morning I got a call on my radio. 3 hikers had gone missing in the past week. Now people getting lost in these woods isn't unusual, it happens every year. But something about these disappearances felt wrong. The way they vanished, it was like they just stepped off the face of the earth. I grabbed my gear, my trusty rifle, compass, and backpack with supplies. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me harder than usual. The birds weren't singing. Even the wind seemed to whisper differently through the trees. 20 years of tracking experience was screaming at me that something wasn't right. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. I was about to face something that no amount of military training or ranger experience could have prepared me for. Something ancient, something hungry, something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. But let me tell you exactly how it all started, and maybe then you'll understand why I wake up sweating every night, why I can't look at the forest the same way anymore, and why I still hear those whispers in the pines. The first strange thing I noticed was the deer. I've seen thousands of deer in my years here, but never like this. They were walking backward, their eyes wide and frightened. It wasn't just 1 or 2, it's entire herds, moving like they were running from something, but facing the wrong way. Even the birds were acting weird, flying in perfect circles until they got dizzy and fell from the sky. I started following the usual trails where the missing hikers were last seen. That's when I found the tracks. At first, they looked like bear prints, but something was off. They seemed to change. One print would look like a bear's, the next like a human's, and then something I'd never seen before. Something huge, with too many toes and deep claw marks. My radio kept crackling with static. The repeater station was down, which meant I was cut off from the nearest town, 40 miles away. The fog was getting thicker by the minute, even though it was almost noon. It shouldn't have been this foggy, this cold. That's when I met Joseph Running Bear, an elder from the local tribe. I found him standing near the trail, like he was waiting for me. His face was serious, worried. "Ranger Hawthorne," he said quietly. The old ones spoke of this. Every 60 years when the moon turns to blood, it awakens. The hunger spirit. The wendigo. I wanted to laugh it off. I'm not one for ghost stories. But the way he said it, and everything I'd seen, something in my gut, told me to listen. 3 days ago, he continued, my dogs refused to enter the north woods. They howled all night. The next morning we found them walking backward, just like the deer. I was about to ask him more when we heard it. A scream that didn't sound quite human. It came from deep in the forest where the fog was thickest. Joseph grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Do not go alone," he warned. "What you find there, it will change you forever." But I had to go. 3 people were missing, and whatever was happening, it was my job to find them. I just wish I had listened to Joseph's warning more carefully. Because what I found in those woods, well, some things you can't unsee, and some hungers never die. I decided I needed help, So the next morning, I teamed up with Deputy Mark Reynolds, a young guy who didn't believe in anything he couldn't explain, and Joseph Running Bear, who knew these woods and their secrets better than anyone. We started our search where I'd found those strange tracks. The fog was so thick now that we could barely see 10 feet ahead. Our flashlight beams just bounced off it, making things worse. That's when our equipment started acting strange. Mark's compass began spinning like crazy, and my reliable old watch started running backward. "Something's not right," Mark muttered, trying to get his radio to work. It only produced sounds that made my skin crawl like whispers mixed with static. We walked for hours until we found something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. There, in a small clearing, we found the first victim, or what was left of them. Just bones, arranged in a pattern that looked like some kind of ancient symbol. The bones were picked clean, but there weren't any signs of animal marks, no bite marks, no scratches. It was like the flesh had just disappeared. But the worst part came when we found the second hiker. He was alive, but something was terribly wrong. We found him curled up in a cave, shaking and mumbling about the hunger. His clothes were torn, and his eyes looked like he'd seen something that had broken his mind. "So hungry," he kept whispering. "It makes you so hungry, but nothing helps. Nothing." Joseph pulled me aside while Mark tried to help the man. "This is how it starts," he said quietly. "The wendigo's hunger is contagious. It makes its victims feel a hunger no food can satisfy, until He didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. Because right then, we heard something that made our blood freeze. It was a voice, a woman's voice, calling my name. But not just any voice. It was Sarah's voice, my dead wife's voice. "Jim? Jim, where are you?" I'm so cold, I knew it couldn't be real. I knew Sarah was gone. But that voice, it was exactly how I remembered it. Mark and Joseph saw my face go pale. "Don't listen," Joseph warned. "It's not her. It's never them." But as the voice called again, something else caught our attention. The fog around us started moving in a way fog shouldn't move. It was swirling, taking shape, and in the darkness beyond it, I saw something that would haunt my dreams forever. Through the swirling fog we saw it, 9 feet tall with skin so gray and thin, you could see its bones underneath. Its head was like a deer skull, but wrong, covered in strange carved symbols that seemed to glow faintly. Its arms and legs were too long, with extra joints that bent in impossible ways. But its eyes, those eyes were like black holes, except when they flashed amber in the darkness. Mark raised his gun, his hands shaking. "What in God's name is that?" Before Joseph could answer, the thing moved. It was so fast, 1 second, it was 30 feet away, the next it was right beside Mark. He tried to shoot, but his gun jammed. We all heard the click of the trigger, followed by Mark's terrified scream as the creature grabbed him. "Run!" I yelled, pulling Joseph back. We ran through the fog, stumbling over roots and rocks. Behind us, Mark's scream suddenly stopped. That silence was worse than any scream. We ran until our lungs burned. When we finally stopped, Joseph pulled out some kind of pouch from his jacket. "Protection herbers," he said, sprinkling them in a circle around us. "It won't stop it, but it might slow it down." That's when we heard it again. Sarah's voice, closer now. "Jim, please, I'm hurt. I need you." My heart felt like it was being torn in two. Even knowing it wasn't real, that voice brought back every memory of Sarah's last days. I felt tears in my eyes. "Focus." Joseph grabbed my shoulder. "This is how it hunts. It finds what hurts you most and uses it against you." We stayed in that circle all night, listening to voices calling us, my wife's voice, Joseph's dead son's voice. The fog kept trying to creep in, but it couldn't cross Joseph's herb line. Sometimes we'd see shapes moving just beyond our sight, and those awful amber eyes watching us. When morning finally came, we went back to look for Mark. What we found, I still have nightmares about it. His body was arranged like one of those cave paintings Joseph had told us about, but he'd been eaten, not like an animal would eat. It was different, worse. Joseph looked at the scene and turned pale. "It's getting stronger," he said. And now it has tasted blood. As if answering him, a low, inhuman howl echoed through the forest. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. "Joseph led me to an ancient cave," he said, "his ancestors used for ceremonies. The walls were covered with paintings that made my stomach turn. They showed the same creature we'd seen, and people running from it, being consumed by it. But one painting caught my eye. It showed warriors using some kind of sacred soil against the monster. Our ancestors fought it before," Joseph explained, touching the cave wall. "The soil from our burial grounds, that's blessed with old magic. It's the only thing that can hurt it." But before we could make a plan, the cave went ice cold. The entrance filled with that unnatural fog. And we heard something scratching at the rocks outside. Joseph started chanting in his native language, holding up a small medicine bag. Then things got worse. The animals came, dozens of them, deer, wolves, even small birds, all with those same glowing amber eyes. The wendigo was controlling them, using them to trap us. "It's possessed them," Joseph said, his voice shaking. "We have to—" He never finished that sentence. One of the possessed wolves leaped at him, teeth bared. I tried to help, but more animals kept coming. In the chaos, I heard Joseph scream. When I finally fought my way to him, I saw his eyes. They were glowing amber. "Kill me," he begged, fighting against whatever was taking control of him, "before it uses me, like the others." I won't describe what happened next. I had to do what he asked. I lost another friend that day, but Joseph died helping me understand how to fight this thing. His last words were directions to the burial grounds where I could find the sacred soil. As I left the cave, the forest had changed. The trees looked dead, even though they'd been alive yesterday. That rotting meat smell was everywhere. And in the distance, I saw the blood-red moon rising. The same moon from the cave paintings. I had one chance to end this. The burial grounds were 5 miles north, and I had to get there before the moon reached its highest point. But with every step I took, I felt that horrible hunger growing inside me, the same hunger that had driven the other victim mad. And behind me, in the fog, I heard it coming, getting closer, hunting me. Every step toward the burial grounds felt like walking through quicksand. The hunger inside me got worse. I was so hungry that my stomach felt like it was eating itself. But I knew if I stopped to eat anything, I'd be dead. The blood moon lit everything in a creepy red glow. The fog followed me, always staying just a few feet behind. Sometimes I'd hear Sarah's voice, or Mark's, or Joseph's, all calling for help. But I kept going, repeating to myself, "It's not real. It's not real." When I finally reached the burial grounds, I almost cried with relief. But that feeling didn't last long. The wendigo was waiting for me. It stood there, all 9 feet of it, those black eyes now glowing bright amber. Up close, I could see all the ancient symbols carved into its deer skull head, each one seeming to move and shift in the moonlight. Hungry, it spoke, its voice sounding like dead leaves crushing underfoot. So hungry, I grabbed handfuls of the sacred soil, just as it charged at me. The thing was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Its long arms reached for me, those extra joints bending in ways that made my skin crawl. One of its claws caught my chest, leaving deep cuts that would later turn into strange symbols. We fought in the fog and moonlight. Every time I threw some blessed soil at it, the creature would shriek, a sound that made my ears bleed. Its skin would smoke where the soil touched it, but it kept coming, kept slashing with those terrible claws. I was getting tired. The hunger was so bad now that I could barely think straight. The wendigo knew it too. It kept getting closer, its mouth opening wider than any mouth should. Then I remembered Joseph's last words. Down its throat. The soil must go down its throat. I had one handful of soil left. The wendigo lunged at me, its impossible mouth wide open. I threw myself forward, straight into those awful teeth. I shoved that last handful of sacred soil straight down the wendigo's throat. Its scream. I'll never forget that sound. Like 1,000 voices crying out at once. The creature's gray skin began turning hard, like stone. Those terrible amber eyes dimmed, and its long limbs started cracking and breaking. But as it died, something happened. The wendigo grabbed my chest, right where it had cut me earlier. A burning pain shot through my whole body. I felt something dark and hungry pass from it into me, through those cuts that had become strange symbols. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. They found me at the edge of the forest, half dead. The official report said it was animal attacks that killed Mark and Joseph. They never found the missing hikers' bodies. Nobody believed my story about what really happened. But I knew the truth. I could feel it in the new hunger that never quite went away. In the way I could suddenly sense things that weren't quite natural. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see a faint amber glow in my eyes. I left Olympic National Forest after that, transferred to a different park far away. But I keep tracking similar stories, following reports of strange disappearances and unnatural fogs. Because part of the wendigo's essence lives in me now. Not enough to turn me into one, but enough to know when others of its kind are hunting. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in the pines. They tell me about other ancient things that hide in dark places, things that hunger, things that hunt, and I know that somewhere out there, another blood moon is rising, another hunter is waking up, and maybe, just maybe, someone else is about to learn that not all monsters are just stories. But at least now, I know how to fight them, and as long as I'm alive, I'll keep fighting. Because if I don't, who will? My name is Victor Ramirez, but everyone calls me Vic. I've spent most of my life exploring caves and rescuing people from them. Right now I'm sitting in my small cabin in the Adirondack Mountains trying to write down what happened last winter. My hands are still shaking as I think about it. I guess I should start with who I am. I'm 43, not too tall, not too short, with a build that comes from climbing mountains all my life. If you look at my right arm, you'll see some nasty burn scars. A reminder of a rescue gone wrong. I can never seem to get rid of my 5 o'clock shadow, no matter how much I shave. My wife used to tease me about it, back when she was still around. 5 years ago, I lost my entire rescue team in a cave collapse. We were trying to save a family trapped by flooding, and, well, let's just say I was the only one who made it out. After that, I couldn't go near a cave for 2 years. I moved to this cabin, away from everyone, trying to forget the sounds of falling rocks and screaming. But caves, they're like an addiction. They get in your blood. Even after everything that happened, I couldn't stay away forever. I started doing small explorations again. Solo stuff mostly. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that could hurt anyone else if I messed up. Then, 3 days before Christmas 1981, my phone rang. It was the kind of call I'd been dreading and hoping for at the same time. 3 geology students had gone missing in a restricted cave system in the mountains. The local rescue teams wouldn't go in minus something about the caves being too dangerous, too unstable. I remember looking out my window at the falling snow, thinking about saying no. It was the worst winter anyone could remember. Temperature so cold it hurt to breathe. The kind of weather that kills people even without adding caves to the mix. But then I thought about those kids, probably scared and cold in the dark. Maybe hurt. Maybe, no, I couldn't think about that. I had to help. I had to try. I didn't know it then, but answering that phone would lead me into the darkest nightmare of my life. What we found in those mountains wasn't just a rescue mission. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. Let me tell you what really happened in those caves. But I warn you, after hearing this story, you might never look at mountains the same way again. You might start wondering what's really hiding in all those dark places underground, waiting to wake up. I arrived at the small mountain town of Pine Ridge the next morning. The whole place was buried in snow, and the few people on the streets hurried past with their heads down against the bitter cold. The police station was a tiny building with Christmas lights still hanging in the windows. Inside, I met Sheriff Tom Baker, a big man with worried eyes. He spread out some maps on his desk and started telling me about the missing students. They were supposed to be studying rock formations, he said, pointing to a spot on the map. Simple stuff. But they went into a section of caves that's been closed off for years. No one's heard from them in 4 days. What about their equipment? I asked, thinking about what could have gone wrong. That's the strange part, the sheriff said quietly. We found their car at the trailhead. All their camping gear was still inside. But their research equipment, lights, ropes, cameras, that was all gone. It's like they went in for a quick look and never came back out. Then he showed me something that made my stomach turn. A piece of metal that looked like it had been melted. Found this near one of the cave entrances, he said. It was part of an old mining cart. The lab says they can't explain what could have done this. I picked up the metal. It was twisted and warped, with holes that looked like something had eaten through it. In all my years of cave rescue, I'd never seen anything like it. There's something else, the sheriff said, lowering his voice. Local hunters have been hearing things, sounds coming from the mountain at night. They say it's like singing, but not human singing. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. I'll need a team, I said. Good people who know these mountains. Already got them waiting, he replied. But Vic, everyone around here knows about what happened to your last team. Are you sure you're ready for this? I wasn't sure, not at all. But those kids needed help, and time was running out. Get your people together, I told him. We start tomorrow at dawn. That night in my motel room, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that melted metal. And somewhere in the darkness, I could swear I heard something too, a faint high sound, like someone whistling from very far away. I didn't know it then, but that sound was our first warning. We should have listened. We should have stayed away from that mountain. The next morning, I met my team at the local diner. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, but my stomach was too nervous to eat. 3 people sat at the table, all of them looking as serious as I felt. Maria Delgado was a geologist with dark curly hair and smart eyes. She knew these mountains better than anyone. The cave system is huge, she said, spreading out her own maps. Miles of tunnels, some so deep we don't even know where they end. Next to her sat Pete Winston, a cave diver in his late 20s. He kept fidgeting with his coffee cup, but his voice was steady. I've been in most of the main caves around here, he said. But that restricted section, nobody goes there. Not since the mining accidents in the 50s. The last member of our team was John Bear, an older local guide with gray hair and a face like weathered leather. He hadn't touched his food and kept looking out the window at the mountain. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. My grandfather used to tell stories about that place, he said. Old stories. Bad ones. He said some things should stay buried. I was about to ask what he meant when Sheriff Baker rushed in. His face was pale. We found something, he said. You need to see this. He led us to his car and pulled out a student's backpack. It was covered in dirt and something else. Something that made the fabric look like it had been partly dissolved. Inside was a journal. The last entry made my blood run cold. Day 2 in the cave. The lights keep flickering, even with new batteries. Jenny says she saw something moving in the dark, but that's impossible. These tunnels have been sealed for years. But the singing, we all hear it now. It's getting closer, and the shadows, they're walking. That was it. No more entries. The rest of the pages were blank. When do we start? Pete asked, his voice shaking a little. I looked at the mountain looming over the town. Dark clouds were gathering around its peak, and fresh snow was starting to fall. We gear up now, I said. Those kids have already been down there too long. As we got our equipment ready, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked at the mountain, it seemed different, like it was waiting for us. I've been in hundreds of caves. I've seen darkness that swallows your light like it's hungry for it. But something about this mountain felt wrong. Very wrong. None of us knew it then, but we were about to find out why those caves had been sealed, and why they should have stayed that way. The hike to the cave entrance took 2 hours through deep snow. Every step was hard, and the wind kept trying to push us back. The cave mouth was a dark hole in the mountainside, like a giant had taken a bite out of the rock. "Look at this," Maria called out, pointing at the ground near the entrance. There were strange marks in the rock, long scratches that looked fresh. "Something made these recently," she said. "Something with claws. Probably just a bear," Pete said, but his voice didn't sound very sure. John shook his head. "No bear made those marks. Look how deep they are, right in solid rock." We turned on our headlamps and checked our radio equipment one last time. The cave entrance was blocked by old warning signs and yellow tape. As we pushed past them, the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The first tunnel went straight down. Our lights showed old mining tracks and rotting wooden supports. But something wasn't right. The metal rails looked eaten away in places, just like that piece the sheriff showed us. "Listen," Maria whispered suddenly. We all froze. From somewhere deep in the mountain came a sound like water dripping, but with a rhythm to it. Almost like music. "The singing," I said, remembering the journal. "That's what the students heard." Pete checked the cave map. "According to this, there's a big chamber about half a mile down. Maybe they went there." As we walked deeper, our lights started acting strange. They would get bright, then dim, then bright again. No matter how many times we checked the batteries, it kept happening. Then we found the first real sign of the students. A candy wrapper that couldn't have been more than a few days old. But right next to it was something else. A strange glowing mushroom I'd never seen before. It gave off a pale blue light that made shadows dance on the walls. "That's impossible," Maria said, taking pictures. "These fungi, they're not like anything I've studied." John touched the cave wall and pulled his hand back quickly. "It's warm," he said. "The rock shouldn't be warm this deep in winter." That's when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any cave. A long, low moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Our lights flickered again, and in the darkness between the flashes, I could have sworn I saw something move. "We need to keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Those kids are down here somewhere." But with every step deeper into the mountain, I felt more certain that we weren't alone in these tunnels. Something was watching us. Something that didn't want to be found. And it was getting closer. The big chamber was huge. Our lights couldn't even reach the ceiling. The air felt thick and strange, like breathing soup. That's when Pete spotted something that made us all stop. "Over there," he pointed his light at the wall. Ancient cave paintings covered the rock. But these weren't normal. They showed tall, skinny creatures with no eyes and long claws. The paintings seemed to glow faintly in our light. "These aren't like any native paintings I've seen," John said, his voice shaking. "My people, they drew warnings about these things. The cave walkers, they called them." Suddenly, Maria called out from across the chamber. "Guys, I found something." We rushed over. It was a student's backpack, half hidden behind some rocks. Inside was a camera still working. Maria pressed play on the last video. The shaky footage showed 3 students exploring the cave. They were excited, laughing. Then the camera turned toward a dark corner and everyone went quiet. A strange singing sound filled the recording. The camera dropped, showing only feet running away. Then screams. Then nothing. That's when our own lights started flickering again. In the darkness between flashes, I heard something moving. Something big. "We need to," Pete started to say, but he never finished. Because right then his light caught something that made us all freeze. On the chamber floor were fresh footprints. Not human footprints. They were long and wrong-looking, with marks that could only be from claws, and they were still wet. "Nobody move," I whispered, but it was too late. From somewhere in the darkness came a sound like someone running their nails down a chalkboard, but much louder. Then another sound joined it. And another. "The exits," Maria said in a tiny voice. "They're blocking all the exits." Our lights flickered one last time, and in that moment of darkness I felt something brush past me. Something cold and smooth. Something that shouldn't exist. When the lights came back on, Pete was gone. All we found was a trail of those wet footprints, leading deeper into the mountain. And now we could hear the singing clearly. It was coming from every tunnel at once. "We have to find him," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside I was terrified, because now I knew what had happened to those students. And I knew we weren't dealing with anything human. We followed Pete's trail through a narrow tunnel, our hearts pounding. The singing was getting louder and the air smelled strange, like rotten eggs mixed with something sweet. "Look at the walls," Maria whispered, pointing her light. The rock was covered in some kind of clear, sticky stuff that seemed to be moving. John touched my arm. "Vic," he said quietly, "my grandfather told me about this. When he was young, people went missing in these caves. They found some of them later, but they were changed. Like the cave had tried to make them part of itself." Suddenly, Maria's light caught something ahead. Pete's flashlight on the ground. Next to it was a piece of his jacket, partly melted like that metal we'd found earlier. The singing was so loud now it made my teeth hurt. That's when we saw it. In a small cave ahead, Pete was stuck to the wall. He was alive but couldn't move. Covered in that clear, sticky stuff. But that's not what made us all stop breathing. Standing next to him was something. It was tall and skinny, with pale skin that you could almost see through. Where its eyes should be, there was just smooth skin, but it had huge ears that kept turning like radar dishes. Its long fingers ended in bone-white claws. The creature was singing to Pete. He stared at it, like he was in a trance. "Don't move," I whispered. "Nobody make a—" But Maria's light chose that moment to flicker. The creature's head snapped toward us. Its mouth opened, and kept opening, showing rows and rows of sharp teeth. "Run!" I screamed, but the creature was faster. It moved like a spider, climbing the walls and More singing started echoing from other tunnels. There were more of them coming. "The flares," John yelled. "Use the flares." I pulled out my emergency flare and lit it. The creature screamed, a horrible sound that made my ears ring. The bright red light seemed to hurt it. "Get Pete," I shouted, holding up the flare like a shield. Maria and John ran forward, cutting through the sticky stuff with their knives. Pete was heavy, barely conscious. As we dragged him away, I saw more shapes moving in the darkness behind us. The creatures were following, just staying out of the flare's light. We ran through the tunnels trying to remember the way out, but in the panic, we took a wrong turn. And that's when we found something worse. Much worse. The tunnel led us into a huge cave, and what we saw there still gives me nightmares. The walls were covered with those clear, sticky cocoons, and inside them were shapes. Human shapes. Some were the missing students, but others looked like they'd been there for years. "They're all still alive," Maria whispered in horror. We could see some of them moving slightly like they were sleeping. Pete was starting to wake up. "The singing," he mumbled, "it gets in your head. Makes you want to stay." That's when John grabbed my arm. "Vic, look up." I raised my flare and my heart nearly stopped. The ceiling was alive with those creatures. Dozens of them, all hanging upside down like bats. They were sleeping, but some were starting to wake up because of our light. "This is their nest," Maria said. "They've been here for generations." Suddenly the creatures behind us caught up. We were trapped. The ones on the ceiling were waking up, and our flare was starting to die. "The mining explosives," John said quickly. "I saw some old boxes back there. If we can set them off, we'll bring the whole cave down. I finished. It was crazy, but it was our only chance. I handed John my last flare. Get them out, I said. I'll set the charges. Vic, no. Maria started to argue, but a screech from the creatures cut her off. Go, now. As they helped Pete toward the tunnel, I ran to the old explosives. My hands were shaking as I set them up, just like I'd been trained. The creatures were getting closer. They're singing, trying to make me stop, trying to make me sleep. I heard Maria scream from the tunnel. They were running out of time. I lit the fuse and ran. The next few minutes were a blur of running, screeching, and falling rocks. The explosion shook the whole mountain. Water started pouring in from somewhere. The creatures were screaming, not singing now but screaming in anger and pain. We barely made it out. As we ran through the last tunnel, rocks were falling everywhere. John got hit bad, but we dragged him along. Behind us, the cave entrance collapsed with a sound like thunder. We lay in the snow, gasping for air, as dawn broke over the mountain. We'd made it out, but we all knew something horrible was still down there. Because even through all that rock we could still hear it, very faintly, singing. The next few days were a blur. The police and rescue teams came, but they couldn't get into the collapsed caves. They said it was too dangerous, too unstable. Maybe that was for the best. John was in the hospital for weeks with a broken leg. Pete couldn't sleep. He kept hearing that singing in his dreams. Maria quit her job at the university. She said she couldn't look at caves the same way anymore. None of us could. The official report said it was a cave-in caused by old mining tunnels. They listed the missing students as presumed dead. But we knew the truth. We knew what was really down there. A month later, I went back to the mountain alone. I had to know if it was really over. As I stood there in the snow, looking at the collapsed cave entrance, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A small hole had opened up near the ground, just big enough for something to crawl through. Around it, the snow had melted in a perfect circle, and there were those claw marks again, fresh in the rock. But worse than that was what I heard. Very faint, carried on the winter wind, was that familiar sound, that horrible, beautiful singing. They weren't all dead. Some had survived, and they were digging their way out. I reported it to Sheriff Baker. He sent people to seal the hole with concrete. They put up new warning signs and fences. But sometimes late at night, hikers still report strange sounds from the mountain, singing sounds. I moved away from the Adirondacks after that, found a new cabin, far from any caves. But I keep track of the dates, counting the years, because John's grandfather was right. These things have a cycle. They sleep for 30 years, then wake up hungry. And by my count, they'll wake up again in 2011. Sometimes on cold nights, I wonder about those cocoons we left behind, about those people, still alive, slowly becoming something else, something that will eventually crawl out of that mountain. I wonder if they're still singing down there, in the dark, and I wonder if anyone will believe this story in time to stop what's coming next. My name is Malcolm Barrett, and I've been a park ranger at Denali National Park for the past 7 years. Most people notice my glass eye first. It's the price I paid for surviving a nightmare in Vietnam that I wish I could forget. But these days I find peace in the quiet of Alaska's wilderness. Well, at least I used to. I remember exactly when everything started to go wrong. It was a bitter cold evening in January 1977, and I was doing my usual radio checks from the main ranger station. The aurora was dancing in the sky that night, more active than I'd seen in years, painting everything in waves of green and purple. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Through the radio static came a signal I hadn't heard since that terrible night in Vietnam. A sort of humming that didn't sound like anything from this earth. The kind of sound that makes your teeth vibrate and your skin crawl. I tried adjusting the frequency, thinking maybe it was just interference from the aurora, but then all our equipment went crazy. The temperature gauges dropped to impossible numbers. The compass needles spun like tops, and through it all that haunting sound kept getting louder. My hands were shaking as I picked up the radio mic. 4 of our research scientists had been up at the old military station near the glacier, and they hadn't checked in for 3 days. I'd been worried, but with the bad weather we couldn't get up there to check on them. But now I knew something was terribly wrong. I still remember looking at my reflection in the station window, an aging man with a white beard and one real eye staring back at me. I thought I'd left all the weird stuff behind in Vietnam. But as that strange sound filled the room and the aurora flickered like a broken TV screen, I realized I was about to face something even worse. If only I'd known then what I know now. If only I'd recognized the warning signs sooner. But I guess that's how these stories always start, with someone like me thinking they've seen it all, about to discover just how wrong they are. I knew I had to do something about those missing scientists. The next morning I made some calls to put together a team. We needed the right people for this mission, especially with all the weird things happening up at the station. First to arrive was Alice Cooper, a young radio expert with bright red hair and more knowledge about frequencies than anyone I'd ever met. She showed up bundled in about 5 layers of winter gear, looking like a walking marshmallow. "Dr. Barrett," she said, adjusting her fogged-up glasses, "I heard you've got some strange signals up here." Before I could answer, our Russian scientist, Dr. Petrov, walked in. He was an older man with tired eyes and a thick accent. Something about the way he looked at our radio equipment made me uneasy, like he knew more than he was telling us. Last came Carl Winters, our pilot. He was the only one smiling, probably because he didn't know what he was getting into. "Weather's clearing up," he announced, stamping snow off his boots. "We can fly out to the station in an hour." I gathered them around the map on my desk. 4 scientists went missing 3 days ago, I explained, pointing to the old military station's location. But that's not all. Last night, our equipment went haywire. The temperature readings made no sense, and there was this sound. I noticed Dr. Petrov's face go pale when I mentioned the sound. Alice leaned forward, interested. "What kind of sound?" "Like nothing you've ever heard," I said, my hand unconsciously touching my glass eye. It reminded me of something from my military days, something that shouldn't be possible. Just then, all the lights in the station flickered. The radio on my desk crackled to life by itself, letting out a low, pulsing hum that made everyone freeze. Through the window, I could see the aurora starting up again, even though it was broad daylight. "That's not normal," Carl whispered, stating the obvious. Alice rushed to the radio, her fingers flying over the dials. "This frequency, it's all wrong. It's like it's coming from everywhere at once." Dr. Petrov muttered something in Russian and crossed himself. I caught his eye, and for a moment, I saw real fear there. "We need to get to that station," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever's happening up there, those scientists might still be alive." But as we gathered our gear and headed for Carl's helicopter, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something terrible. The sound from the radio followed us out, and overhead, the impossible daytime aurora twisted like a snake in the sky. I'd been through enough in my life to know when something was deeply wrong, and everything about this situation was screaming danger. But 4 people were missing, and it was my job to find them, no matter what was waiting for us up in those frozen mountains. The helicopter ride was rough. The wind kept hitting us from all sides, and Carl was fighting to keep us steady. I could tell something wasn't right. The compass kept spinning in circles, and our radio picked up nothing but static and that weird humming sound. "Look down there," Alice shouted over the noise, pointing out the window. My stomach turned when I saw what she was pointing at. There was a herd of moose, completely frozen in place. They weren't just standing still. They were actually frozen solid, like ice statues. Some were even frozen mid-run. "This isn't normal ice," Dr. Petrov mumbled. His face pressed against the window. "In Siberia, we saw something similar, but..." He stopped talking suddenly, like he'd said too much. The military station came into view. It was an ugly gray building sitting on top of a snowy hill, with a tall radio tower reaching into the sky. But something was off. The metal of the tower was covered in weird ice patterns, like frozen snowflakes the size of car tires. Carl landed the helicopter about 100 yards away. The second we stepped out, all our phones died at once. The cold hit us like a wall, but it wasn't normal cold. It felt wrong, like it was reaching inside us. "The door's open," I said, pointing to the station's entrance. It was swinging back and forth in the wind, banging against the wall. "Stay close together." We walked in with our flashlights on. The inside of the station was a mess, papers everywhere. Coffee cups still half full but frozen solid, chairs knocked over. It looked like everyone had left in a hurry. "Dr. Barrett," Alice called out, her voice shaking. She was standing by one of the computers. "Look at this." The computer screen was on, which was impossible because the power was out. Numbers and letters were flowing across it, making no sense. But worst of all, there was frost growing out of the screen, forming those same weird patterns we saw outside. Then we heard it, "Ening," coming from the old radio room down the hall. That humming sound, but louder now, and mixed with what sounded like voices speaking backwards. Dr. Petrov grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," he whispered, "now." Before it, the lights suddenly came on by themselves. Every computer in the room started up at once. The humming got so loud it hurt our heads. And there at the end of the hall, we saw something that made us all stop breathing for a second. The air was moving, like waves in a pond, but in the air itself. And in the middle of it, ice crystals were forming into shapes that shouldn't be possible. "Oh God," Carl whispered. "What is that?" Before anyone could answer, every radio in the station turned on at full volume, and that's when things got really bad. The sound hit us like a physical force. Everyone covered their ears, but it didn't help. The noise seemed to be inside our heads. Through the pain, I saw Carl stumble toward the door. "I'll check the helicopter," he shouted. "Maybe we can call for help." "Carl, wait," I yelled, but he was already running outside. That was the last time we saw him alive. The rest of us huddled in the main room. Alice worked frantically at one of the computers while Dr. Petrov paced back and forth, muttering to himself. I kept watching the hallway, where that strange moving air was slowly creeping closer. "Dr. Barrett," Alice called out, her voice trembling. I found the research team's last video log. The screen flickered to life. One of the missing scientists appeared, looking terrified. "Something's wrong with the frequencies," he said. "The military. They were doing experiments here. Sound experiments. They found something that shouldn't exist. It's in the sound waves. It's the video cut off." That's when Dr. Petrov finally broke. "I knew this would happen," he shouted. "Just like in Siberia. The Soviets found it first, tried to control it. But you can't control it. It's ancient. It lives in the spaces between sounds." Before we could question him further, the radio crackled. "Help, help me." It was Carl's voice. We ran outside. The storm had gotten worse, and the aurora above us was moving like a giant snake. We found Carl near the helicopter, but I'll never forget what we saw. He was frozen solid, but not like normal ice. His eyes were replaced with perfect ice crystals, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. The worst part was the radio in his hand. It was playing backwards voices, even though it had no batteries. "Inside. Now," I ordered, pushing everyone back toward the station. But as we ran, I noticed Dr. Petrov's eyes. They had the same glassy look I remembered from Vietnam, right before I lost my patrol team. We barely made it back inside when all the lights started flashing. Dr. Petrov turned to us slowly, frost forming on his beard. When he spoke, his voice wasn't his own anymore. "It's too late," he said in a voice that sounded like 100 people talking at once. "It's already here." Alice grabbed my arm. "Dr. Barrett," she whispered. "I think I know what this thing is, and I think I know how to stop it. But you're not going to like it." Alice pulled me into the radio room, slamming the door just as Dr. Petrov started walking toward us with jerky movements, ice crystals forming around him. "Look at this," she said. pointing to her calculations. The thing out there, it's like a living frequency. It exists in sound waves, but it needs extreme cold to take physical form. That's why it's here, in Alaska. The door rattled. Through the window, we could see Dr. Petrov's face pressed against the glass, his breath freezing in impossible patterns. In Vietnam, I said, my hand touching my glass eye, before I lost my team, we heard the same sound. The military covered it up, said it was just a weather phenomenon. They lied, Alice said, typing frantically. This thing, it's been here forever. The military found it, and tried to use it as a weapon, but they lost control. The whole room was getting colder. Ice started creeping up the walls, forming those weird geometric patterns. The radios around us came to life, playing voices of people I knew were dead. My old team from Vietnam. We can't kill it, Alice explained, but we can trap it. Every frequency has an opposite that can cancel it out. If we can generate the right counter frequency, she looked at me with sad eyes. But someone has to stay in the radio tower to broadcast it. My stomach dropped. Alice, no. The door burst open. Dr. Petrov stumbled in, but he wasn't really Dr. Petrov anymore. His skin was transparent like ice, and his movements were all wrong, like a broken puppet. You cannot stop what has always been, he said in that horrible multi-voice. Alice grabbed the modified radio equipment she'd been working on. Run to the tower, she shouted. I'll hold him off. I can't let you go, she screamed. This is the only way. Someone has to survive to warn others. I ran. Behind me, I heard Alice start broadcasting her counter frequency. The thing that used to be Dr. Petrov screamed in a way no human throat could make. The air itself seemed to ripple and crack. From the tower, I watched as the station lit up with impossible colors. Alice's voice came through my radio one last time. It's working. The frequency is, then static. There was a flash of light that hurt my eyes. When I could see again, the station was covered in ice, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a scream. I stood in the tower, shaking from both cold and fear, watching the ice spread across the station. Through the windows, I could see Alice, or what was left of her. She had become something like a statue made of sound waves and ice, frozen in her final moment of sacrifice. The thing that used to be Dr. Petrov was gone, but the air still moved strangely. The humming hadn't stopped, it had just changed. Now it sounded sad, almost like it was in pain. My radio crackled. Through the static, I heard Alice's last recording playing on loop. The frequency, it's trapped now, but not forever. That's when I saw them. The missing research team. They were in the corner of the station, frozen just like Carl. Their faces looked peaceful, like they'd just fallen asleep. Their notebooks were open, pages filled with warnings they never got to share. The government cleanup crew arrived 3 days later. Men in white suits who didn't ask questions. They took everything, the bodies, the equipment, all the evidence. They even tried to take my notes, but I'd already hidden them. This never happened, they told me. You found the research team frozen in a normal storm. Nothing more. But they couldn't hide everything. The station is still there, behind layers of warning signs and fences. On quiet nights, when the aurora is bright, people say they can hear strange sounds coming from it. The ice patterns never melt, even in summer. I retired from the ranger service after that. My hearing's mostly gone now, a side effect, the doctors say, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that humming, and when I do, the temperature drops, just a little. Alice was right about one thing, it's not destroyed, just trapped. The military still monitors the frequencies, waiting. They know what I know. Someday, it will find a way to break free, and when it does, it'll remember us. It'll remember how we tried to control it, how we tried to trap it. I've written this all down because people need to know the truth. If you ever hear a strange humming, if you ever see ice forming in impossible patterns, if the air starts to move like water, run. Run as fast as you can, because sound travels everywhere, and some frequencies were never meant to be heard by human ears. My name is Catherine Winters, but everyone calls me Kate. I never thought I'd be telling this story. The story that changed everything I knew about the waters I once loved. As I write this, my hands still shake when I think about what happened at Shadow Lake. I used to be an Olympic swimmer and later became a Park Service ranger. For 8 years I helped keep people safe in the wilderness. The white streak in my dark hair often made people curious. Some thought it was a fashion choice, but it appeared after a drowning accident when I was 9. I survived, but that day left its mark on me in more ways than one. That summer of 1975 started like any other in northern Minnesota's boundary waters. I was 35 then, fit and ready for anything. Or so I thought. The heat was unusual that year, making the air thick and heavy. Strange storms would roll in without warning, lighting up the sky with purple-white flashes. It all began with the 3rd drowning in a month. I still remember that morning, the fog hanging low over Shadow Lake like a white blanket, the unusually cold air for August, and the call that would drag me into a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. Ranger Winters, the voice on the radio, crackled. "We've got another one, same as the others." I grabbed my gear and headed out. I was about to uncover something that had been hiding in Shadow Lake's depths for decades. Something that would force me to face not only my childhood fears but horrors beyond anything in this world. This is my story. A warning, really. Because sometimes what lies beneath the surface is far worse than any nightmare you could imagine. And Shadow Lake, it's still out there, its waters hiding secrets that should never see the light of day. The call came at 6:30 a.m. I drove my ranger truck along the bumpy forest road, the morning mist still thick around me. As I got closer to Shadow Lake, something felt different. The usual morning bird songs were missing, and the air felt heavy, like right before a big storm. I parked near the shore where 3 police cars and an ambulance were already waiting. Officer Mike Thompson, who I'd known for years, walked over to meet me. His face was pale. "Kate, you need to see this," he said quietly. "It's just like the others." The body lay on the rocky shore, covered with a white sheet. What I saw when they pulled it back made my stomach turn. John Miller, a local fisherman I'd known for years, looked like he'd aged 50 years overnight. His skin was gray and wrinkled, like he'd been underwater for weeks, but he'd only been missing for 12 hours. "That's not normal drowning," I said, my voice shaking a little. "The water temperature was 75 degrees yesterday. This looks like he was frozen." Mike finished my sentence. In the middle of August, as we talked, I noticed something odd in the water. Just for a second I thought I saw lights moving under the surface, like blue fireflies dancing in the depths. I blinked, and they were gone. Later that day, I went through the reports of the other 2 drownings. Sarah Chen, a college student, found 3 weeks ago. Then Tom Roberts, a camping guide, just 10 days later. Both bodies showed the same strange signs: aged, frozen-looking skin, even though the lake was warm. That evening, I sat in my office, looking at photos of the victims. My hand touched the white streak in my hair, a reminder of my own brush with drowning years ago. Something wasn't adding up. 3 experienced swimmers don't just drown in calm water. As I was about to leave, my phone rang. It was Linda Whitebear, an elder from the local Ojibwe tribe. "Catherine," she said, her voice serious, "we need to talk about Shadow Lake. There are things you need to know, things our people have known for generations." I looked out my window at the darkening lake. For a moment I thought I saw those strange lights again, moving deep beneath the surface. "I'll be right there," I said, grabbing my jacket. I didn't know it then, but that phone call was the beginning of everything, the start of a horror that would change my life forever. Linda Whitebear lived in a small house at the edge of the forest. When I arrived, she was waiting on her porch, a cup of steaming tea in her hands. Her face looked worried in the fading light. "Come in, Catherine," she said, "we have much to discuss." Inside, she showed me something that made my heart skip. An old stone tablet with drawings carved into it. The images showed people swimming, and below them, a long snake-like creature with glowing eyes. Our people have known about it for hundreds of years. Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every 30 years it awakens. The waters become hungry. I tried to stay skeptical. Linda, I deal with facts, evidence. This could just be an old story. She cut me off. Then, explain the bodies, Catherine. Explain the lights people see under the water. Explain why even the fish are leaving Shadow Lake. Just then, thunder rumbled outside. Another strange storm was rolling in. There's more, Linda continued. In 1945, some government scientists came here. They did experiments in the lake. After that, things got worse. The creature changed. My phone buzzed, not a text from Mike. They'd found something near the shore. As I stood to leave, Linda grabbed my arm. Catherine, listen carefully. It doesn't just kill moths, it learns. It remembers. And it's getting stronger. Driving to the lake, her words kept echoing in my head. At the shore, Mike was waiting with a diving team. They'd found unusual readings in the water. Extreme cold spots and strange current patterns that didn't make sense. We need someone to check it out, Mike said. Someone who knows diving. I looked at the dark water. The storm was getting closer and lightning flashed in the distance. Those mysterious blue lights were back, moving deeper into the lake. I'll do it, I said, even as my childhood fear of drowning made my hands shake. But I'm not doing this alone. I need a team. That night, I made 3 phone calls. I needed the best people I could find. Because whatever was in Shadow Lake, I had a feeling we were running out of time to stop it. As I finished my last call, the storm finally broke. The rain hit my window like fingers tapping on glass, and in the distance, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like singing coming from the lake. Within 2 days, my team arrived at Shadow Lake. Dr. Eric Palmer was the first Matza marine biologist with messy gray hair and thick glasses. He'd studied strange water creatures for 20 years. Then came Frank Torres, one of the best divers I knew, with more underwater cave experience than anyone else. Finally, Sarah Little, a young local historian who knew every story and secret about this area. We set up our base in an old cabin by the lake. While unpacking our equipment, I told them everything: the drownings, Linda's warnings, and the strange lights in the water. Look at these readings, Dr. Palmer said, showing us his instruments. The water temperature drops from 75 degrees to 35 degrees in specific spots. That's impossible in August. Frank was checking his diving gear when all our equipment suddenly went crazy. Compasses spun in circles and our phones lost signal at the same time. Guys, Sarah called from the window. You need to see this. We rushed outside. The lake's surface was completely still, mice, too still like glass. But beneath, those blue lights were moving again, forming a circle deep under the water. We need to get down there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. First dive tomorrow morning. That night, none of us slept well. The air felt electric, and strange sounds kept coming from the lake, like whispers mixed with the splash of water. At 3 a.m., I woke up to find Dr. Palmer standing at the shore staring at the water. Eric, I called out. What are you doing? He turned slowly, his face pale in the moonlight. It's singing, Kate, can't you hear it? The most beautiful song. I pulled him back to the cabin, but his words sent chills down my spine. Looking back at the lake, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A large dark shape moving just beneath the surface, leaving a trail of glowing blue light. As we prepared for tomorrow's dive, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there was waiting for us. And somehow, it knew we were coming. Morning came too quickly. The lake was covered in mist as Frank and I put on our diving gear. Dr. Palmer would monitor us from the boat, while Sarah kept track of our location. Testing, testing. Frank's voice crackled through our underwater radio. All set. I nodded, trying to calm my racing heart. The water was surprisingly warm at the surface, but I knew that would change as we went deeper. Be careful down there, Sarah said, her face worried. Remember, if anything feels wrong, come back up immediately. We slipped into the water at 7 a.m. The visibility was good for the first 30 feet, but then everything changed. The temperature dropped so suddenly it felt like jumping into an ice bath. Our lights showed something strange ahead. What looked like old stone walls, covered in the same markings Linda had shown me. "Kate, are you seeing this?" Frank's voice shook slightly. "These aren't natural formations." That's when our lights caught something that made us both freeze. A massive pile of bones lay scattered across the lake bottom, fish bones, deer bones, and some that looked disturbingly human. "Dr. Palmer," I called through the radio. "We've found." The radio crackled with static. At the same moment, those blue lights appeared all around us, moving in circles. The water got even colder. "Frank, we need to." I turned, but Frank wasn't there. My light beam caught him about 20 feet away, swimming straight down as if in a trance. "Frank, stop." I swam after him, but the water seemed to fight against me. That's when I heard it. A sound that shouldn't be possible underwater. Singing. Beautiful but terrifying, like 1,000 voices calling at once. My light flickered and died. In the darkness I saw something move. Something huge. A long, snake-like shape passed between me and Frank. Its skin almost transparent, showing organs glowing with that same blue light. Multiple eyes opened along its side, all staring right at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature moved closer, its body seeming to split into 2, then 4 separate shapes. My head felt fuzzy, and images flashed through my mind. Memories of drowning as a child, but somehow different, darker. Using all my strength, I swam up, grabbing Frank's arm on the way. He snapped out of his trance, and we raced for the surface. Behind us, I heard something that sounded like laughter echoing through the water. We burst out of the water, gasping for air. Sarah and Dr. Palmer pulled us onto the boat. Frank was shaking so badly he could barely speak. "Something's down there," I managed to say between breaths. "Something big." But when I looked at Dr. Palmer, something was wrong. He was staring at the water with a strange smile on his face. "Did you hear it?" he whispered. "The singing, it's beautiful, isn't it?" Back at the cabin, we tried to make sense of what happened. Frank's hands shook as he drew what we'd seen. The long, snake-like body, the glowing eyes, the transparent skin. "Look at this," Sarah said, spreading out old newspapers on the table. "In 1945, the government did secret experiments here. They never said what they were looking for, but after that, people started seeing strange lights in the water. Suddenly, all our lights flickered. The temperature dropped so fast we could see our breath. Outside, another storm was rolling in. "Eric? Where's Eric?" Sarah asked, looking around. I ran to the window and my heart stopped. Dr. Palmer was walking into the lake, fully clothed. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. "Eric? Stop." I ran outside, but the wind was so strong I could barely move. By the time I reached the shore, he was chest deep in the water. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were glowing with that same blue light we'd seen underwater. "They're calling me Kate. They want to show me everything." Then he disappeared under the surface. We searched for hours in the storm, but there was no sign of him. When we finally went back inside, we found his research notebook. The last page was filled with the same words written over and over. "The water knows. The water remembers. The water wants." That night, I woke up to the sound of water dripping. Opening my eyes, I saw wet footprints leading to my bed. They were Eric's size, but something was wrong with their shape, like his feet had started to change into something else. The next morning, Frank couldn't stop pacing. "We need to find Eric. He could still be alive." Sarah was going through Dr. Palmer's notebook, her face getting paler with each page. "Guys, look at this." The day before he disappeared, he wrote about hearing voices in the water. They were telling him about some kind of transformation. Just then Mike called. They'd found something on the beach. Dr. Palmer's glasses, but they were different. The glass was clouded over with some kind of blue film, and the metal frames looked partially melted. "We have to go back down there," I said, even though every part of me was screaming not to. "Kate, are you crazy?" Frank grabbed my arm. That thing nearly got us last time. But before we could argue more, all the water in our glasses started shaking. Through the window, we saw the lake's surface bubbling, like it was boiling. Then we heard it nice, a horrible screeching sound that made our ears hurt. We ran outside and froze in horror. There, at the edge of the lake, was something that looked like Dr. Palmer but wrong. His skin was almost see-through, and his eyes glowed that terrible blue. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice wasn't human anymore. Kate, Frank, Sarah, he gurgled, water dripping from his mouth. It wants you to join us, all of us. Behind him, the water churned, and those massive shapes rose to the surface. Not one creature now, but three. Their long bodies glowed in the darkening sky, and dozens of eyes blinked at us. Run! I screamed. We sprinted back to the cabin, but I'll never forget what I saw when I looked back. Dr. Palmer's body seeming to melt, flowing into the water like he was becoming part of it. Inside the cabin, Sarah was already grabbing the files. The government records, she said, breathing hard. They weren't studying the lake. They were trying to contain something they found in an underwater cave system. Thunder cracked overhead, and the lights went out. In the darkness, we could hear water trickling under the door. In the dark cabin, we could hear water splashing against the walls. Our flashlights showed water seeping in from everywhere, under the doors, through the windows, even from the ceiling pipes that shouldn't be leaking. The files. Sarah grabbed the government documents, trying to keep them dry. Listen to this, 1945. They found something in the deepest cave. They tried to study it, but it split into multiple creatures. They couldn't control them. Suddenly, Frank's flashlight caught something that made us all freeze. The water on the floor wasn't flowing naturally. It was moving in patterns, like it had a mind of its own. We need to get out of here, I said. Now. We ran for my truck, splashing through ankle-deep water. The lake was going crazy, with waves crashing against the shore even though there was no wind. That's when we heard it. Dr. Palmer's voice, but it was coming from everywhere. The water remembers you, Kate, it gurgled. It remembers when you almost became part of it as a child. My head started pounding as memories of my childhood. Drowning came flooding back. The truck wouldn't start. My teen swatter had gotten into the engine. The boathouse, Frank shouted. We can use the emergency radio there. We ran through the rain, but halfway there, Frank stopped. His face went pale. Do you hear that? The singing, Frank, no. I grabbed his arm, but he pulled away, walking towards the water like he was in a trance. Sarah and I tried to stop him, but the ground under him suddenly burst open with a geyser of lake water, pulling him down. Help, he screamed, before disappearing into the dark water. Sarah pulled me toward the boathouse. We can't help him now, we have to call for help. Inside the boathouse, Sarah's hands shook as she worked the radio. Mayday, Mayday, this is Shadow Lake. We need a. She never finished that sentence. The whole boathouse groaned like it was being crushed. Through the windows, we saw them, of three massive shapes surrounding us, their blue eyes glowing in the darkness. The boathouse walls creaked as water poured in from every crack. Sarah was still trying to use the radio, but all we could hear was static and that terrible singing. Kate! Sarah screamed, pointing at the window. One of the creatures was right there, its transparent body pressed against the glass. Inside its clear skin, we could see what looked like Frank's diving watch, floating among its glowing organs. Suddenly, the floor beneath Sarah collapsed. Water rushed in like a giant hand, pulling her down. Sarah, I grabbed her arm, but the force was too strong. The last thing I saw was her terrified face as she was dragged into the dark water. I was alone now. The creatures circled the boathouse, their bodies creating waves that made the whole building shake. Through the windows, I could see their multiple eyes all fixed on me. Then I heard Linda's voice in my head. It learns, it remembers. Looking around desperately, I noticed something. Every time lightning flashed, the creatures pulled back slightly. They were afraid of the electricity. There was a fuse box on the wall, and some old fishing wire nearby. It was crazy, but it was my only chance. As water rose to my waist, I started pulling out electrical wires. You want me? I shouted at the water, "Come and get me." The largest creature crashed through the window. As it reached for me with its glowing tentacles, I threw the live wires into the water.
Yeah.
The creature screamed, the sound like metal scratching glass, as electricity coursed through the water. The whole lake lit up like it was on fire. I saw their massive bodies thrashing, splitting apart, then coming together again. In that flash of light, I also saw something else, bodies floating in the depths, dozens of them, all with the same peaceful expression Dr. Palmer had worn. The boathouse was falling apart. I had to swim for it. Taking a deep breath, I dove into the electrified water. The shock from the electrified water felt like thousands of needles in my skin. As I swam, memories of my childhood drowning hit me hard. The panic, the darkness, the feeling of water filling my lungs. But this time was different. This time I was fighting back. Lightning flashed overhead, and in that bright moment, I saw them all around me. The creatures were wounded, but still coming. Their bodies were breaking apart and joining together again, like melting glass in the water. The largest one opened its mouth, showing rows of glowing blue teeth. "You're just like us now, Kate." It spoke with a mixture of voices. I could hear Dr. Palmer, Frank, and Sarah among them. "The water has changed you too." They were right about one thing. The water had changed me. That childhood incident had left me with a fear that controlled my life. But not anymore. Another lightning bolt hit the lake. Closer this time. The creatures screamed and scattered. That's when I realized the storm wasn't natural. The lake itself was fighting back against these things. I swam deeper, following their retreat. My lungs were burning, but I kept going. They led me to a huge underwater cave. The same one from the government files. Inside I saw something that made my heart stop. A massive cluster of eggs, all glowing with that same blue light. This wasn't just about stopping them. It was about stopping them from spreading. The creatures surrounded me, their bodies forming a cage of glowing flesh. As they closed in, I felt the water temperature dropping rapidly. Ice was starting to form around me. "Join us," they whispered. "Become one with the water." But I had one last trick. I'd kept one live wire wrapped around my arm, saving it for this moment. With my last bit of strength, I unwrapped the wire from my arm. The creatures were so close now I could see my own reflection in their transparent skin. In that moment, I saw my 9-year-old self, drowning in that lake years ago. "This ends now," I thought, and thrust the live wire into the cluster of eggs. The explosion of electricity lit up the entire cave. The creatures screamed, a sound that shook the whole lake. Their bodies started breaking apart, but this time they couldn't pull themselves back together. The glowing blue light began to fade from their eyes. I felt something grab my ankle. It was what remained of Dr. Palmer, his face half human, half creature. "Kate, help me," he gurgled. But it was too late for him. The electricity had done its work. The cave was collapsing, and the creatures were dissolving like ice in hot water. My lungs were about to burst. Pieces of the cave were falling all around me. As I tried to swim up, my foot got caught between rocks. Black spots danced in my vision. This was it. I was going to drown, just like in my childhood. Then I felt hands grabbing me. Human hands. Through my fading vision, I saw rescue divers. Someone had heard Sarah's Mayday call after all. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. They told me they found no trace of the creatures, no bodies, nothing except some strange burn marks in an underwater cave. The government quickly closed off Shadow Lake, claiming it was contaminated by a dangerous algae bloom. But sometimes on stormy nights, I still see those blue lights moving under the surface of other lakes. And I wonder, did we really stop them? Or did they just move somewhere else, waiting, learning, remembering? Because that's the thing about water, it never really forgets, and neither do I. It's been 6 months since that night at Shadow Lake. I left the Park Service, couldn't bring myself to work near water anymore. The white streak in my hair, it spread, now covering half my head. Doctors can't explain it. Linda Whitebear was right about one thing. The creature learned and remembered, and I think it left something of itself in me. Sometimes when I'm near water, I can feel it calling. Even a glass of water on my bedside table seems to whisper at night. The official story says it was all an accident. 3 drownings, 2 missing researchers, and 1 ranger who had a stress-related breakdown. The lake is still closed off with high fences and warning signs. Last week I got a strange package. Inside was Dr. Palmer's old notebook, somehow perfectly dry despite being in the lake. On the last page, in handwriting that wasn't there before, were these words: "The water is patient, Kate. We're still here, still growing, still learning." Yesterday, I heard news about unusual drownings in a lake 2 states over. The bodies were found with strange injuries, looking decades older than they should, and witnesses reported seeing blue lights moving under the water. I should tell someone. I should warn them. But who would believe me? So I'm writing this down instead, a warning for anyone who might listen, because those government files were right about one thing. They didn't find the creature in Shadow Lake. It found them, and now, it's finding others. If you're reading this, and you see blue lights under the water, run. Run as fast as you can, because the water remembers, and what it remembers, it wants to keep forever. This is Catherine Winters, signing off. And if you never hear from me again, well, just stay away from the water, especially at night, especially when it calls your name, because sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones that try to kill you, they're the ones that want to make you one of them.